Hello, and welcome to the Geocurrents Lecture Series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections. Today's lecture will cover elections from 1920 to 1936, in other words, during the Roaring Twenties and into the early years of the Great Depression. The main themes are going to be how both parties moved to the right in the 1920s and became essentially conservative, and this was a period of tremendous Republican triumph, landslide elections, all three of them in the 1920s. And then after the stock market crash of 1929 and the beginning of the Great Depression, the whole country moves markedly to the left, especially the Democrats, but Republicans do to some degree. And this is a period of tremendous Democratic triumph with landslide elections. The end of World War I brought trouble to the United States. World War I had actually been an economic boom time for, especially for agriculture. When the war ended, there was something of an agricultural depression. There was also the great Spanish flu pandemic, which hit the United States very hard. And had its highest levels of mortality with relatively young people, unlike most flu epidemics. So the devastation of that epidemic is not to be underestimated. So the country was in something of a bitter mood, regardless of the fact that the United States was on the victorious side in that war. When the war ends in 1918, the Republicans take the Senate and they expand their House majority. You can see here seat change, 24 seats gained by the Republicans, giving them a pretty solid lead, 240 to 192. In the Senate, it's quite a narrow lead, only two seats. But you can see on the map the Republicans really gaining strength in a lot of their traditional strongholds in the Midwest, particularly some of the western states as well. 1919 saw a couple of very momentous things occurring in the United States. One was the failure of Woodrow Wilson's post-World War I agenda. Wilson had pushed for the war to be a transformative war, a war to end all wars, as he put it, that would be marked at the end by the creation of a League of Nations, which would join countries together to prevent the further outbreak of war. There's a tremendous amount of idealism associated with that. But it failed. It failed in the Senate. A lot of Republican senators had real serious reservations about the Versailles Treaty that would have brought in the League of Nations. Particularly, they thought that it would be an infringement on U.S. sovereignty. There were certain articles within that treaty that they objected to. Wilson was not inclined to compromise with them. He just wanted to push it through. He thought he could. And the Senate vote on the treaty was 55 in favor and 39 against, but that was not enough to see it pass through. So the United States did not ratify the treaty and did not join the League of Nations, which was created nonetheless, but without the U.S., which had been the sort of the instigator of the whole thing, or began the process and then pulled out. So the League of Nations began its career in a very sort of weakened status. Henry Cabot Lodge, Senate Majority Leader, he became Senate Majority Leader in 1919 after the 1918 election, led the opposition to the Treaty of Versailles. We see a political cartoon for him with Henry Cabot Lodge trying to teach a parrot, which is the Republican press, to say Wilson did it, which one could make that argument. Another cartoon from a very different perspective showing Woodrow Wilson blowing soap bubbles of idealism to conjure up the League of Nations. And then Henry Cabot Lodge again with a bandaged up Treaty of Versailles as he tried to push through these reservations, like I said before, that Wilson rejected. In the same year, later in the year in October, Woodrow Wilson suffered a severe and debilitating stroke. He was essentially out of power for the rest of his presidential term, although the American public didn't really know it. It was concealed from the public to a significant extent by Edith Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's second wife. Hadn't been married to her all that long, but she was able to control access to him and sort of acted as his his voice during that period. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty and scholarly debate about what was actually happening. But as this HistoryNet headline says, how Woodrow Wilson's hidden illness left America with no president for over a year, a pretty disturbing situation. Some people who say there were parallels with that of Joe Biden in 1924, although Wilson's disability was vastly greater than Biden's. I think almost everyone would agree about that. At any rate, the 1920 election saw an overwhelming triumph by Republican Warren Harding over Democrat James Cox. As you can see, 64% to 34% in the popular vote. The Electoral College was a little more balanced, but not that much more. As the map shows, Cox only had support in the South and didn't even get all southern states. Tennessee notably went to the Republicans. It's the first time in a long time. As I've talked before in this lecture course, Eastern Tennessee had a number of very strongly Republican counties, but the state as a whole had been reliably Democratic voting. An interesting election as well, because both candidates were quite unremarkable. Both were quite relatively conservative, by today's standards, very conservative. Very similar background, both from Ohio. Cox was a newspaper magnate and had been governor. Harding was a newspaper owner, a senator as well, but not impressive candidates, at least in the assessment of most historians. I do want to note, though, the landslide nature of this election, with Harding getting almost a little bit less than twice the vote of Cox. And to note that a lot of pundits and journalists are saying that 2004 was a landslide election, but it was far from it. It just shows you that, we live in an age of political hyperbole, and also we have not had a real landslide election since 1984, a victory of Ronald Reagan over Walter Mondale. Elections now today tend to be pretty close, as the electorate is quite evenly divided. That wasn't always the case, as we'll see throughout the rest of this lecture. One notable thing on this map is how German-American areas, parts of the United States had been settled heavily by Germans, especially areas that had been settled relatively recently, upper Midwest and into the northern Great Plains states, states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, North Dakota. Previously, German-American areas in the South, like the Missouri Rhineland or the Texas Hill Country, had been strongly Republican voting, but in the North, mostly Democratic voting. And that really changed to a large degree because of Woodrow Wilson's very decidedly anti-German actions during World War I, shutting down German schools, shutting down German presses, and the like. So the Democratic Party became associated with sort of an anti-Germanism. And you could see North Carolina, there's very, very clear Republican voting. That doesn't mean that North Dakota is a conservative state. Far from it. We'll look at that a little bit later. It shows some of the complexities of the situation. Also, I've mentioned in this course several times division of Missouri. And you can see here the Little Dixie area that had originally been settled by Southerners, plantation owners, slaveholders along the Missouri River, maintained very strongly Democratic voting through this period. Whereas just to the south in the eastern part, you had the so-called Missouri Rhineland, heavily settled by Germans after the failed revolution of 1848. Tend to be a liberal Republican area. Ozark Plateau, also very highly Republican at this time. There was little support for Cox even in New York, which had been and will continue to be a real strong Democratic stronghold. One of the reasons here was it was not just the German Americans, but also Irish Americans who, for a period of time, not a prolonged period of time, but an acute period, definitely turned against the Democratic Party. Treaty of Versailles was seen as pro-British, a lot of anti-British sentiments in the Irish community, and a lot of sort of anger about what was seen as a Anglophilic number of Anglophilic political maneuvers under the Wilson administration. So you can see New York City on the map actually voting Republican, very rare. Yeah, Manhattan is on the map is not dark red, but it is red, and that is quite unusual. In this same election, 1920, Republicans made huge gains in Congress. You could see gaining 63 House seats with the popular vote just overwhelmingly large compared to the Democratic vote, with the Democrats pretty much restricted to the South and a few large cities in the Northeast. Not much more. A few seats in the West as well. In the Senate, you could see another huge gain. Republicans up 10 seats, Democrats down, and across the West, those dark red states, that shows Republican gains. So you could see really decidedly in the West, many of these areas had voted for the Democrats in the period of Woodrow Wilson, but that's a thing of the past. And the only Senate seats retained, none gained, but retained, were all in the Southeast at this time. Warren Harding was relatively popular in office. The economy recovered. The Roaring '20s begins. It's good economic times. He didn't do much, but the country was doing well. But he died in office I believe, of a heart attack after a few years. But after that, a number of scandals emerged, particularly something called the Teapot Dome scandal, which was over oil leases, sort of sweetheart deals. And it turns out the Harding administration was quite corrupt. There's a lot of evidence. Although some people think Harding himself has been unfortunately maligned. I note here, he died near the end of his term and was replaced by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. But I found it interesting that some 10 years ago, Slate magazine ran an article about reassessing Harding. What if he wasn't such a terrible president? Well, one can make an argument that he wasn't terrible, but I don't think anyone is going to make an argument that he was a very effective president. He was intellectually a lightweight, I suppose you could say. He was his critics say he was more interested in playing poker with his friends and gambling and drinking than he was being engaged with the office. That's probably unfair, but he did like his entertainment. Certainly at the time, a lot of pundits were not at all impressed with Warren Harding. And I'll read you a quote from H.L. Mencken. Now, Mencken was an extremely important figure at the time, Baltimore-based journalist, also something of a self-taught scholar, wrote on the American use of the English language, quite a wit, an extreme elitist, had contempt for common people, contempt for religion, especially fundamentalist religion, a bit of a follower of the German philosopher Nietzsche. But Mencken, like I said, was quite influential. He's probably best known today for this quote on the bottom: democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. I mean, that really sums up Mencken. But I do find it worth repeating a line about a speech, Mencken responding to a speech by Harding. It is so bad that a sort of grandeur creeps into it. It drags itself out of the dark abysm of pish and crawls insanely up to the topmost pinnacle of posh. It is rumble and bumble, it is flap and doodle, it is balder and dash. And just one other thing about Mencken, he's was known for reporting on the so-called Scopes monkey trial. I believe he gave it that term. So this was a trial in Pennsylvania against a teacher who was teaching the Darwinian theory of evolution, which was illegal at the time. A very famous trial, Clarence Darrow defending Scopes, and the prosecution was led by William Jennings Bryan, three-time presidential candidate, left-wing populist, but also quite a strict Christian fundamentalist. Although I will note, Bryan was not a young earth creationist. He was of a school of thought that allowed that the Hebrew term that was translated into day in the Hebrew Bible actually meant a period of time. So he did not believe that the earth was created 6,000 years ago, as the most extreme fundamentalists do. But he certainly didn't like the could not tolerate the idea that human beings were descended from lower mammals, if you will. Also, the other part of the slide here is a fictionalized version of this trial called Inherit the Wind. The names have been changed, but it's basically on this trial. Quite worth watching, in my view. Anyway, the 1920s was a conservative decade. It was a period of tremendous economic satisfaction and well-being. The economy was roaring. That's why it's called the Roaring 20s. Huge increase in GDP. A lot of technological innovations. This is the time when mass ownership of automobiles comes about, and radio comes on. Some would say that it roared a little too loudly, that there was a lot of excess speculation in the economy, especially in equities and stocks, people borrowing to buy more stocks, which was then to set the economy up for a fall, which happened in 1929. It was also quite a conservative decade. Warren Harding ran on the platform of return to normalcy, an odd word. Actually, originally in the speech it was written as normality. I think he misread it as normalty, and then newspaper editors turned it to normalcy. But there was discontent about the progressive movement that had been so powerful. From the ascension of Theodore Roosevelt to the president, all the way through Woodrow Wilson. So both Republican Roosevelt and Democrat Wilson had a very progressive agenda and brought about a lot of changes, which were much appreciated and generally endorsed by the American public. But by the 1920s, the mood had really shifted. People wanted to go slow on the progressive agenda, if not bring it to an end altogether, and return to a more quiescent time of American politics, if you will. And this decade was also noted by a huge revival of the Ku Klux Klan, which had been almost defunct after Ulysses S. Grant and some other Republican presidents took it on after the Civil War, but it came back in a big way. There's also a decade of growing nativism, opposition to immigration. My next slide will show information on the Immigration Act of 1924. Alcohol was prohibited. This was also the period when women's suffrage came in at the same time. So there are some countervailing trends, I suppose you could say. The Immigration Act of 1924 essentially prohibited immigration from Asia, or at least East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. People from the Middle East could still migrate, but in small numbers, essentially, because immigration, first of all, overall it was capped at 160,000. That's about an 80% reduction from what was happening before World War I. And then national quotas were established based on each nation's share in the total population. So if a country had not sent many immigrants to the United States, they would not be able to send many in the future. Those who had sent large numbers would have more leeway in that regard. And immigration really did plummet, as you could see from this bar graph here, really reaching a height in the first decade of the 20th century, and then dropping down after the Immigration Bill of 1924, and then again in World War II when it becomes virtually impossible. And then I believe that act was repealed in 1965, and immigration can start to build up again, and no longer with the prohibition from Asia. I showed this slide much earlier in this lecture series, but it's worth revisiting, which is the battle for the presidency in 1924. So Harding is gone, Coolidge has taken over, but the Democrats have a big battle to determine who their candidate is going to be. They were just destroyed in the previous election. They obviously wanted to change that, but they were very much divided between the southern and northern branches of the party. So the northern branch was mostly urban, especially in big cities. Ethnic Americans like Irish Americans, German Americans were very prominent in the party. And then the southern branch, which was very much Protestant. The two branches were very divided over issues like prohibition, the Northern Democrats being wets and the Southern Democrats being generally dries. And you could see here there was a lot of insults going on. The two leading candidates were Al Smith, who had been mayor of New York, governor of New York, Irish Catholic, anti-nativist in favor of immigration, anti-prohibitionist. I'll have a slide on him later on. And William McAdoo, who had been Treasury Secretary, was son-in-law of Woodrow Wilson, Southern background, although he moved to California. He was a nativist, a prohibitionist, and a Ku Klux Klan sympathizer. And so the two factions had no love lost for each other. And after 103 ballots over 17 days in a sweltering New York heat wave, a compromise or dark horse candidate was selected, John W. Davis. He was from West Virginia, sort of in between the North and South, but a Wall Street lawyer, former ambassador to the United Kingdom, so he was an important figure. But he goes on to take less than 30% of the popular vote in that election, so not successful. And one reason why his popular vote total was so low is because there was an important third-party candidate. So with both the Democrats and Republicans being quite conservative at this time, and the progressive agendas just sort of stalled out, well, that left a lot of frustration among some people who did want a more progressive approach to government. And into that void stepped Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, who had built up a very sort of powerful political organization in Wisconsin, very successful in the state, and with a very clear agenda. In the end, though, La Follette gets, well, you can see the vote total here. He gets 16% of the vote. Calvin Coolidge, the incumbent, a clear majority with 54%, not as much as Harding, which was over 60, but still way ahead of the others, and overwhelming win. You can see that Davis took only all the states in the former Confederacy, as well as Oklahoma, and essentially that was it. La Follette took his home state of Wisconsin and nothing else. So Calvin Coolidge triumphed everywhere else. Coolidge was very much a small government conservative, very far removed from the activist presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. He had been well known, got national fame when he was governor of Massachusetts and called in the militia to shut down a Boston police strike and fired the striking officers. And he said that public safety comes first. Police strike is absolutely abhorrent, and we're going to have nothing to do with it. He also signed one progressive act allowing citizenship for Native Americans or American Indians who had not had citizenship previously and finally get it. Also signed the Immigration Act that I talked about. Coolidge is noted for, well, his laconic manner. Silent Cal tells you that, but also his philosophy of little government action. He said, one of his more famous quotes is, "The business of America is business." Or another one here I have, "I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves." He was also, at least some sources claim that he himself took a relatively relaxed attitude to the presidency, worked maybe 4 hours a day. I'm not sure if that's true or not. In the county level electoral maps, we can see very distinct patterns. Now, this map shows margin of victory, sort of percentage margin of one candidate over the other. So the dark red, Coolidge leading the other candidates by more than 30%. It's, or the dark blue, Davis doing the same. And it's really a remarkable pattern you could see across the Northeast, including Michigan as well. I mean, that's every county in Michigan, with just a couple of exceptions. It's a Coolidge by more than 30%, and Davis by more than 30% across most of the South. You could see, it's a fairly, in the eastern half of the country anyway, it's it's that middle zone that's competitive. Places like southern Ohio and into southern Illinois and the like. And then you can see La Follette really doing well in his home state of Wisconsin, where he had been very popular, and then winning a lot of counties across the northern tier in Minnesota, North Dakota especially. Some very strong support in a few areas of Montana, quite well in California. In fact, it's interesting to look at California. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, the Democratic Party was almost dead in California at this time. John Davis got 8%, 8.2%. I mean, that's extraordinarily low. It was essentially an election between Calvin Coolidge, conservative Republican, and Robert La Follette, a former progressive Republican running under the progressive platform. But Calvin Coolidge did well. Where La Follette did the best is in, the Sacramento County, the state capital, but the other counties there are mining counties, ranching counties, sparsely populated in the northeastern part of the country. Today, these are some of the most conservative counties in California. Not all of them, but certainly some of them. So a real change in political orientation of of many areas of California. So La Follette is worth considering in a little bit more detail. So a former Republican progressive, but he ran his own party that he created, this new progressive party. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt had called his Bull Moose Party the Progressive Party, but this is a new party. But he ran it in quite a top-down manner, and it was not established nationally. That's one reason he wasn't able to compete nationally. He was able to compete in some parts of the country, and that party organization that he created was very effective in Wisconsin, but was very difficult to transfer it to other states. He got a lot of endorsements from labor leaders and socialists and many intellectuals. Republican response was, though, that if La Follette were to win it would result in chaos. And I do want to mention one real important difference in the progressive ideology of La Follette versus the progressive ideology of Theodore Roosevelt, or I could say Woodrow Wilson as well, as it turned out. La Follette was very much opposed to war. Every nation has its war party, he said. It is commercial, imperialistic, and ruthless. It tolerates no opposition. And Theodore Roosevelt was quite aggressive and an imperialist, quite frankly. And Wilson was reluctant to enter World War I, but when he did so in a big way. These are things that La Follette did not like. He was on the pacifist side of things. And if we look at the areas that where he did well, you can see it's pretty restricted. Most of the country, very low. Even areas that had a lot of progressive people who had supported Theodore Roosevelt were not ready to go for him. There is a bit of a correlation with areas that had a lot of Swedish and especially Norwegian immigration, German to some extent, and the La Follette vote. That's by no means perfect, but it is notable. You can see especially North Dakota, if you go back one slide, North Dakota right there in the north central part of the country. La Follette did not take it, but he certainly did very well in much of the state. And you can see that's a very large amount of Norwegian especially, but also Swedish and German immigration in North Dakota. And at this time, North Dakota actually is the most left-wing state in the nation. It comes under the domination of something called the Nonpartisan League, which is kind of a misnomer because essentially it's a North Carolina-based progressive party, or left-wing party, we could say. It advocated state ownership of banks and agribusinesses. By that I mean the businesses that supply agriculture. North Dakota was and still is a highly agricultural state. The Nonpartisan League, though, portrayed North Dakota farmers as being under the control of businesses based out of Minneapolis, which was the business hub for that northern tier of states. And the Nonpartisan League was able to actually gain control of both houses of the state's legislature in 1918 and control it for quite a few years. And I have an illustration here, a cover of their newsletter, and you can see a looks like a farmer and a laborer looking down at a very small, fat man who represents plutocracy or wealth. Another thing to note was though that outside of Wisconsin, strong support anyway for Robert La Follette was mostly rural, and I use this cartogram to illustrate it because we could see in the center north, that's Wisconsin. All those green counties go a little bit further to the west, and we're into Minnesota, and the counties where Minneapolis and St. Paul are located. I've indicated here, that's the metropolitan center of that northern plains area, if you will, and they went Republican. It was the rural counties that tended to vote for the progressive La Follette. So let's then jump up to 1928. So if you remember 1924, Al Smith of New York made a very powerful bid for the nomination. He did not win it, but the Democrats are, again, hungry for victory. They had been decimated in the last two elections, and the convention turns to Smith. He had substantial support over most of the country. You could see the map here shows the first vote, and you could see Smith dominating the West, Upper Midwest, Northeast. A lot of resistance in the South, though. Resistance to Smith as a New Yorker, as a Catholic. The only Southern states that went for him were Louisiana, which was about half Catholic, about the only Southern state with a large Catholic percentage. Also Arkansas and Kentucky, but generally a lot of opposition in the South. Florida was the only Southern state with a primary election at the time. None of the rest had it and would not have it for some time. But you could see he pretty easily won the nomination. So Al Smith was quite noted as the first Catholic nominee. He was a very interesting man. He had not only did he have no college education, he had no high school education. One of his famous quotes was that he said, "I was educated working at the Fulton Fish Market." But he was a very intelligent, fast learner, very affable, made friends easily, made connections. He was a real networker and organizer, and rose steadily in the New York City political world. And he had the interesting position of being both a political reformer, but also somebody who satisfied Tammany Hall, this Irish-dominated political machine, Democratic Party political machine that often ran New York City. Often regarded as highly corrupt. It depends on what time period you're talking about. Tammany Hall was not noted for its progressive reformism, but Al Smith was able to push through a lot of very important labor reforms and others. This was especially the earlier progressive period had been one where there was just a tremendous desire of many in the country to establish safe conditions for workers and reduce exploitation. Smith was an excellent orator, but he had a very heavy New York accent. There are recordings of him, you can listen to it, and it worked well in New York City, but it didn't work very well nationally. As I said, he opposed prohibition. He was also known as the happy warrior because, like I say, he was a cheerful, affable person, which can be very effective in politics. Ronald Reagan would be another example, but didn't shy away from fights. It's also important to note that he worked very closely with Belle Moskowitz. So Smith himself was mostly of Irish background. Belle Moskowitz, a Jewish political leader, often described as the most powerful woman in U.S. politics, but Smith and Moskowitz worked very closely together. Some would say that she was essentially his political partner, and probably hasn't got as much attention as she deserves. At a time when there were few powerful women in politics, she was certainly one of them. The Republicans at this time turned to Herbert Hoover, sometimes called the Great Engineer. He graduated in the very first class of Stanford University. Stanford originally had no tuition, Hoover came from a fairly poor background, so that was important. But Stanford also had a lot of geology and mining engineering at the time, which is what Hoover did. He went into mining engineering, became an entrepreneur, worked in many parts of the world, was in China, was in Australia. Later came to political attention. He led the Commission for Relief of Belgium after World War I, which is an important job because the people of Belgium were essentially starving. And Hoover was, he was another fairly laconic person. He was not a particularly good speaker or particularly affable, but he was very, very capable in organization, in administrative work, in creating a bureaucracy. He had never been elected to any office, but he had been the Secretary of Commerce, and he was called the unofficial undersecretary of all other departments. So very ambitious, very hardworking, very capable, but not a what you would think of as a standard politician who's able to deeply appeal to voters. His running mate was also very important and very interesting. I think Charles Curtis. He's a Native American. Well, he's 3/8 Native American. Through his maternal line, his mother was the descendant of two important indigenous political leaders. One of the Kaw Nation. Kansas comes from the Kaw. The other, the Osage, which in the 1920s, the Osage were a pretty rich group because of oil deposits found in their reservation. He was partly raised by his maternal relatives on the Kaw Reservation, but he was able to have a very successful political career. He became Senate Majority Leader. And his ancestry wasn't really an issue, which I find very interesting. It's kind of surprising, actually. But one reason why was he was a fervent advocate of assimilation, assimilate into the white majority culture, which he himself obviously did. In this election, one of the big issues was Catholicism. So anti-Catholicism was quite strong in many parts of the country, and those who opposed it said that a Catholic president would not be independent, that his actions would be dictated by the Pope. And you can just see this very clearly in the political cartoon on the right with the Pope at the head of the table. It looks like cardinals sitting around it, and that's if Al Smith were president. Or on the left, you can see why Smith can never be president, the candidate of the Papal-Crat Party. So it wasn't until John Kennedy was elected in 1960 that this idea that Catholics are not necessarily loyal to the United States, their highest loyalty is to the Pope, was finally put to rest. Although Joe Biden, I think, was the only other Catholic president that the U.S. has had. In the election, Smith does somewhat better in the popular vote. He got a little over 41% to 50. You can see the 58% of Hoover. I mean, that's still only a slight election, and compared to the election of 2024. Interestingly, Smith was able to take two northern states, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, which had a long heritage of being Republican bulwarks. But larger cities, Boston and Providence, had very large immigrant populations, highly Catholic. A lot of them are Irish. And Smith then was able to take those states. On the other hand, he lost states in the South. This is the fewest southern states that any Democrat had for a long time. And you can see in the Electoral College, it was even more of a landslide. He only got 87 votes to Hoover's 444. If we look at a county level map, and again, this is by margin of victory, we can see some interesting things. We still see these landslide counties over most of the country. You could see, though, to my mind, one of the most interesting things was the Florida vote, this really sort of hard turn to the Republicans in many parts of the state, particularly in the Florida Panhandle. This was one of the largest county level shifts the country has ever seen. You could go back and look at the same area in the 1924 election and look at this massive red shift here. It seems to have been a region of particularly sort of fanatical anti-Catholicism. It was an area that had not had much in the way of plantation agriculture, relatively small black population, mostly whites. There wasn't as much concern here for the possibility of integration. So one of the things that the Southern Democrats said about Hoover was he's a closet integrationist. He wants to integrate the races. And that led areas that, like South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, which were dominated by, this is a time when blacks could not vote, dominated by whites who were very, very racist and unwilling to contemplate integration. Those are areas with large black populations. So an interesting difference here. And in the north, you can see a few quite aberrant counties. I've just called out a few of them just to note. In many cases, you can see in Pennsylvania, there one county, Elk County, surrounded by deep red counties, and then it's blue. Well, it's 70% Roman Catholic. Or Stearns County in Minnesota, that's where St. Cloud is, very heavily Catholic. Some of the counties in southern North Dakota. I actually did a little map comparison to look at the vote. So at the bottom, Smith is in those the blue color, and then the heavily Catholic counties are in a dark blue color as well. And I've outlined them. And there's a bit of a correlation, but by no means perfect. And I did the same thing with Lutheranism, to indicate the heavily Lutheran counties in the vote, and the vote vote for Republicans in this case. And yeah, there is a correlation, but it's imperfect. There's some counties that just don't fit it. And if we look at it as a cartogram, where you can really see New York City and you can see Boston, they disappear in that earlier map. So you can see that's why Smith won Massachusetts. He lost almost all of the state, but Boston, where most of the people did, he did quite well. Or in Minnesota, it's interesting because with the Twin Cities, St. Paul is much more quite heavily Catholic. Minneapolis was not and is not. And you can see Ramsey County, where St. Paul is voting for Smith, and then Minneapolis just to the west voting for Hoover. At any rate, shortly after not long after Hoover's election, 1929, you have the stock market crash, and then you have the Great Depression begins. It doesn't happen immediately, but it's failure after failure builds up. 1931 saw a huge wave of bank failures. There was no deposit insurance. People are doing runs on the bank, pulling out their money. Banks fail. Hoover keeps the U.S. on the gold standard. He's actually have a major tax increase to balance the budget. Generally, economists would see that as a very counterproductive activity. Just putting more pressure on an economy that is failing. So his efforts to revive the economy were ineffectual, if not self-defeating. The same with the Republican Congress. A Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was passed in 1930. You could see on the graph here that after it passed the Senate, you could just see the major decline in the value of U.S. equities. Then reaching a nadir somewhat later, and also both Smoot and Hawley losing their seats in the midterm election. Yeah, the world economy was quite integrated by this time. The U.S. put these huge tariff barriers up, and then other countries responded in kind, tariffs on U.S. products, and made manufacturing, in some cases, difficult because supplies were needed from abroad. So very few, if any, economists would suggest that this was a wise decision. And you can see how high the tariffs were. I talked in an earlier election about the Tariff of Abominations, 1828, which ushers in the age of Andrew Jackson because of opposition to it. But you could see on here, at least on dutiable imports, up to the sort of same level. And it is notable that the Great Depression was very much a global thing, but it hit the U.S. particularly hard. You could see industrial production in the U.S. going down 46% as opposed to 23% in the U.K., 24% in France. Or you can see unemployment going up far more in the U.S. Than in major European countries. So no surprise, the 1932 election, a watershed election, a transformative election, it's going to really change things. But let's before we look at the election, let's talk about the Democratic nomination. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, wins that nomination. You could see in the primary elections for states that had them at this time. And you can see a couple more southern states have added primaries, Georgia and Alabama. But Roosevelt does better than any of his competitors. Al Smith is trying again, but winning primaries only in New Jersey and Massachusetts. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was very well positioned to get this nomination because he had both progressive and populist inclinations. So as I mentioned before, progressives and populists, certainly left-wing populists, had a lot in common. Well, all populists essentially, with the progressives, but populism tended to be sort of more of a bottom-up phenomenon, and progressivism more of a top-down. And Roosevelt sort of combined both of those inclinations, but he also a patrician from a very, very wealthy family, New York family. Now, William Jennings Bryan, playing the populist card a few generations earlier, he didn't have that advantage. He's from a rustic from, I think he was born in Illinois, but he represented Nebraska. And Roosevelt being part of the social set of the financial elite of the country, it was more easy for him to be accepted by that group. And so he won the nomination pretty handily, and then won the general election in a landslide. You could see 57 to 39 in terms of the popular vote. In terms of the Electoral College, more of a landslide, 472 versus 59 electoral votes. So Herbert Hoover, in seeking re-election, goes down to an ignominious defeat. The map shows you just a handful of states, all in the northeastern part of the country. Northern New England had been the most important Republican stronghold and continues to be for some time. So Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and then add to that Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. You look at the county level seats, you can see that Hoover did quite well across the Northeast at the county level. Western New York took almost every county, down into, sort of on beyond that zone. I didn't win New York because of the importance of New York City. But outside of the Northeast, counties voting for Hoover are relatively sparse. Old Republican stronghold in northern Illinois, going a little bit into southern Wisconsin, southern Utah, not many people there, but not much more. Well, the Republican strongholds in southern Appalachia, eastern Tennessee, parts of eastern Kentucky. If you look at the cartogram, you could see that here you could see New York City very prominently. Explains why Roosevelt was able to win the state. You can see that Roosevelt took Cook County in Chicago, where Chicago is, Wayne County, where Detroit is, Cuyahoga County in Ohio, where Cleveland is. So did well in large cities, did well in rural counties, did well in most of the country. And also you could see just overwhelming support in the far south. And in this same election, the Democrats make huge gains in Congress. Gargantuan gains in Congress. See the Republicans losing 101 seats and the Democrats gaining 97, giving the Democrats an advantage of 313 to 117. And you could also see on the map Democratic gains in what had been many Republican strongholds, even areas that that Hoover won. You can see in Maine there and several other areas. So a real transformative election in the House as well, and in the Senate. Look at the gains of the Democrats. 12 Senate seats. That's remarkable across the West, parts of the Midwest, and even into New England, areas that were against the Republican base at that time. This is very important. It allowed Roosevelt to really start his term quickly. First 100 days, huge flurry of actions passed by Congress because he had its support at this time. Interesting, the highest Republican vote is in these counties in south central Appalachia. You could see some counties in Kentucky and Tennessee with over 80% of the vote going for him. And you can see a few counties, some in the South and some in the Midwest, going just overwhelmingly for Franklin Roosevelt. Radicalism was not particularly popular, wasn't popular at all in this election. The American Communist Party, less than 1% of the vote. I think like 1/4% of the vote or something. But I do find it fascinating that there were a few little areas where the Communist Party did quite well. Sheridan County, Montana, sparsely populated farming county right along the Canadian border. William Z. Foster, the communist candidate, this is where he did the best, I think by far, almost 18% of the vote. Something I really haven't been able to understand myself. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that it's quite sparsely populated, and there was a lot of agrarian unrest at the time. The Depression was horrifically bad for farmers. And when you're sort of small and isolated enough, you could maybe just have a few individuals in that county who were able to convince many others to vote that way. If I had more time, I'd look into this in more detail because I find it a really interesting and surprising thing. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all the details of this slide, but like I said before, in Roosevelt's first 100 days and on through his first term in office, there's just a tremendous amount of really transformative bills passed. Social Security Act may be the most important one, but a lot of bills to put people to work, bills to rein in banking and business, and to bring benefits to the public. So quite popular. But he didn't go far enough for some people. There were challenges from the left-wing populism, we might say. Huey Long of Louisiana in particular, whose tagline was share the wealth. I'll read the quote from him. There is only one way to save our people, only one way to save America. Pull down wealth from the top and spread it to the bottom. Free people of the debts. So, strict redistribution of wealth from the wealthy to the non-wealthy, which was not what Roosevelt was doing at all. He was, he created Social Security and a lot of relief and a lot of jobs programs, and certainly upset the elite and the wealthy with a lot of his economic policies. But he certainly was not willing to go as far as Huey Long wanted him to. And at the same time, in alliance with Huey Long was a very controversial figure, Father Charles Coughlin, originally Canadian, I believe, but he became moved to the U.S. and became a radio priest, and he had a huge radio following. I think it was like 30 million people, and he was very much I would say started as a left-wing populist, but then there can be a fine line between left-wing and right-wing populism, and he turned right and was actually quite sympathetic to Italian fascists, German Nazis even. But there was a lot of concern that Huey Long of Louisiana would challenge Roosevelt from the left, but he was assassinated in 1935, so that didn't happen in this sort of movement to try to outflank Roosevelt on the left. Didn't come to pass. Roosevelt was generally extremely popular, and so these efforts did not work. And in 1936, conditions were improving. The economy was doing better. Unemployment was still high, but it wasn't as high as it had been. The Republicans turned to a former bull moose or Rooseveltian, Theodore Rooseveltian progressive, Alf Landon of Kansas. Landon accepted much of the New Deal, but criticized it as being wasteful and inefficient, that it could be done better. A lot of political pundits thought that Landon was on his way to victory, but George Gallup was developing at the time scientific or accurate polling, and he said, no way, there's no way is Landon going to win. And well, it turned out that Gallup was right, and this sort of starts the era of scientific polling, although it's going to have a number of problems down the road. We saw this in 2024, didn't we? Polls didn't perform very, very well. But this is another overwhelming landslide. Roosevelt did quite a bit better than he had done 4 years earlier, got over 60% of the vote. Landon took only Maine and Vermont. Every other state went for Roosevelt. So in the Electoral College, I think this was the biggest landslide. If we look at county level mapping, this is not the margin of victory, but just what each candidate who took a particular county, what their percentage of the vote was. And you can see the real strict regional pattern, just overwhelming support in the South with a couple of little exceptions. I've done a call out for the German Hill Country voting Republican. But you could see it's quite similar to the previous map, with Republican strength being limited to a few counties in the Midwest. That the Republican readout in parts of Kentucky and Tennessee, and then the northeast of the country, particularly upstate New York. But actually, in Massachusetts and Connecticut, we have a lot more Democratic trending counties than we had before. Even more Republican losses in Congress. I mean, they're down to 88 members of the House and 16 of the Senate. I mean, the Republican Party is just struggling at this time. You can see in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin and Minnesota, progressives, and in Minnesota, Farmer Labor Party, which is a bit further to the left than the Democrats, at least as it's usually explained, did quite well. The Republicans picked up a few seats in the Northeast, but the Democrats picked up a lot more, and you could see Republicans are really restricted in the House to a pretty small part of the country. Now, there's another economic downturn in 1937, the year after this election. This will be the last slide in this lecture, and I'll show the same slide again to begin the next lecture. But this was quite a shock. You can see that unemployment had really been falling, and then boom, it goes back up. Another round of bank failures and the like, and it was shocking. Roosevelt himself blamed big business. He said they were trying to hurt the economy to undermine the Democrats. A new school of economics was rising at this time, Keynesianism, after John Maynard Keynes, a British economist. And Keynes said that to tame the business cycle, what government should do is what would be known as counter-cyclical spending. In other words, the government should be spending a lot when a depression or recession is occurring to keep up demand, to keep up employment. And then, according to the original Keynesian model, when in boom times, then the government should do the opposite, and it should spend less. Now, the first part of that Keynesian equation has been easier to fulfill than the second part. So critics would say that Keynesianism has led to huge deficits, but that was not how it was originally formulated, at least as I understand it. So Keynesian economists said, one of the problems is Franklin Delano Roosevelt was unwilling to run large enough deficits to maintain demand and the economy. Anti-Keynesian economists, though, have a very different view. They claim that Roosevelt's anti-business policies exacerbated the Depression. And there are a lot of economists who think that the Depression would have ended much sooner. Now, it's highly debated, obviously, and I'll talk a bit about that in the next lecture. But it is important to note how unusual this depression was. The U.S. had had many, many recessions and depressions. They came every 10 years or so, but they usually lasted a year or two. The Great Depression essentially lasted 10 years, so quite a difference. So that is the end of this lecture. We'll pick up this story in the next one. So thank you for listening, and I hope you can tune into the other geocurrents lectures on U.S. presidential elections. Thank you.